Beneath the dazzling halls of Versailles, where gold gleams and music never stops, something else grows quietly. A sweetness rises through the marble floors, at first perfume, then something darker, impossible to name. For centuries, servants vanished without record, their bodies carried down narrow tunnels that were never meant for people, only water and waste. Bones piled silently, walls slick with the residue of life and death, until the palace itself seemed to breathe, to remember, to feed. And when the revolution came, the halls emptied, but below, the palace had already consumed its foundation. Every step above rested on those who never left. The mirrors reflect light, but the tunnels reflect something else entirely. The first thing discovered was not a body, but a smell. It rose slowly from beneath the mirrored halls, seeping through marble seams and warming the cold air like a breath held too long. At first it was mistaken for excess perfume, the usual collision of musk, powder, and floral oils that clung to Versailles like a second skin. But this sweetness lingered after the courtiers departed, after the candles burned down, after the doors were shut and locked. It thickened at night, especially beneath the grand gallery where chandeliers fractured light into endless copies of itself, dazzling above while something unseen matured below. Versailles was built to overwhelm the senses. Gold dazzled the eyes, music drowned thought, fabric whispered status with every movement. Yet beneath that excess ran a quieter system, one never mentioned in pamphlets or praised in letters. Staircases narrowed as they descended, ceilings lowered, air grew damp and cool. These passages were not meant for kings or guests. They were service arteries, carved for drainage and refused long before mirrors arrived. Over time, they learned a new function. They learned how to carry away what could not be allowed to remain above. Servants disappeared regularly, though never officially. A footman fainted and failed to rise. A maid collapsed behind tapestries she had dusted moments earlier. Hunger was fashionable at court, discipline absolute, and exhaustion common enough to be unremarkable. When a body appeared, it was handled without ceremony. Wrapped quickly in linen already soaked with sweat and incense, it was lowered down the back stairs by others who understood that pausing invited replacement. No prayers followed. No records were kept. The palace did not need to remember what it consumed to function. Below, the tunnels filled gradually. Bodies waited longer than intended, stacked against walls meant to guide water, not flesh. Stone absorbed oils from powdered wigs, traces of blood, the sharp rot of organs breaking down in air that never truly moved. The smell changed as it aged, blending decay with luxury until it became something new, something uniquely Versailles. Sweet enough to confuse. Heavy enough to linger. By the time courtiers noticed it creeping into their salons, it had already soaked into the bones of the building. Blame traveled upward. Perfumers were accused of excess. Servants were accused of negligence. Rival factions accused one another of sabotage. No one accused the palace itself. Yet stone has memory, and Versailles remembered everything pressed into it. Beneath the mirrors, beneath the music and silk, something was accumulating patiently. Layer by layer, the unacknowledged weight of labor and death settled into the foundations. Above, light multiplied endlessly. Below, something else was doing the same, and it had begun to announce itself in the only way it could. Versailles devoured people quietly, with the patience of a machine designed to never acknowledge waste. The Sun King demanded splendor without pause, a performance that could not sleep, dim, or hesitate. Every corridor above glittered, every surface reflected authority, and every hour required bodies to sustain it. Servants learned this quickly. They learned to move without sound, to keep their eyes lowered, to shrink themselves until they blended into walls lined with gold. Hunger was not an accident, but a discipline. Thinness signaled obedience. Exhaustion proved loyalty. Collapse was the natural conclusion of service carried out too well. Those who worked the palace understood where they could fall and where they could not. To faint beneath a chandelier invited attention. To stagger in a gallery risked scandal. The acceptable places were narrow passages behind tapestries, stairwells where light failed, storage rooms that smelled of polish and damp fabric. There, silk never brushed stone. There, Bodies were discovered hours later by others who recognized the signs and did not ask questions. Versailles did not permit interruption. One servant lost could not delay a dinner, a ceremony, a royal mood. Removal followed a pattern refined over years. At night, when music faded and the court retreated to private chambers, a small group moved through the back ways with practiced efficiency. The body was wrapped quickly, not out of respect, but necessity. Linen already carried the dampness of sweat and incense, the smells of labor and ritual mingling indistinguishably. Faces were covered to prevent recognition, though few could have named the dead, even without cloth. Names mattered above. Below, they had no function. The staircases used for this work were not meant to be noticed. They tightened as they descended, each turn stealing air and sound. Hands brushed walls slick with age, stone worn smooth by generations who passed through without leaving records. These stairs predated mirrors and marble. They belonged to an earlier logic of architecture, one concerned with water flow, waste, and removal. Versailles had expanded upward in defiance of restraint, but its underside remained practical, unforgiving, and efficient. The dead followed gravity into these spaces as naturally as runoff. The tunnels themselves were low and uneven, their ceilings marked by mineral stains that resembled shadows caught mid-motion. Water channels ran along the sides, carrying away what the palace expelled. Over time, these channels learned a new cargo. Bodies were placed against walls at first, propped temporarily until carts could move them farther away. But distance was a luxury. As numbers increased, efficiency overtook intention. Temporary became habitual. Habit hardened into system. Stone responded. It absorbed oils from skin powdered daily to appear clean, the residue of pomades and perfumes that had masked decay above. It drank the copper of blood released when bodies shifted or split. It held the sweet rot of organs breaking down in air that never truly circulated. The tunnels smelled not like death alone, but like death filtered through luxury. It was a confusing scent, cloying and warm, difficult to identify as danger. Those who worked below noticed headaches, pressure behind the eyes, a persistent thickness in the lungs. They learned to breathe shallowly and leave quickly. The stacking became more deliberate. False walls were erected when corners filled. Loose stone was set back into place with mortar mixed hastily, sealing in what space could no longer accommodate. Bones pressed against one another in darkness, femurs crossing broom handles, skulls rolling into angles that suggested attention rather than collapse. No markers distinguished one from another. Equality arrived only here, stripped of uniform, stripped of function. The palace above continued to shine, unaware or uninterested in the arithmetic below. Servants began to avoid certain routes, not out of superstition at first, but instinct. Some passages felt warmer than others, their air thick and resistant. Sound behaved oddly, footsteps landing too softly, then echoing too late. Lantern light dulled against walls that no longer reflected properly. A few swore they felt movement beneath their hands, a subtle shift like settling earth, though nothing should have been loose. Fatigue explained most things. Fear explained the rest. Above, celebrations intensified. The Sun King's appetite for display only grew. Feasts stretched late into the night. Music filled every chamber. Perfumes layered thickly to compete with one another, saturating the air until even breath tasted expensive. With each celebration, the smell below grew stronger. It rose slowly, patient and persistent, seeping through seams no architect had intended to seal. It threaded its way upward through service shafts and forgotten ducts, learning the palace from the inside out. When the scent finally reached the salons, it was already too complex to name. Courtiers blamed excess fragrance, then accused servants of poor hygiene, then whispered about sabotage. Blame circulated endlessly, never settling. The idea that the palace itself was producing the smell remained unthinkable. Versailles was not supposed to have an underside. It was meant to exist entirely in light. Below, the work continued. Bodies arrived regularly, sometimes two in a night, sometimes more after particularly elaborate events. The tunnels no longer felt empty between removals. They felt occupied. Pressure built slowly, not enough to alarm, just enough to be noticed. The stone seemed tighter, closer, as if narrowing by degrees too small to measure. Those tasked with carrying the dead learned to hurry not because they feared discovery, but because lingering felt intrusive, like overstaying in a place that was already full. No ledger recorded these movements. No official account acknowledged them. Versailles consumed labor, flesh, and time with equal indifference, converting all three into stability above. The Sun King slept surrounded by reflections of himself, unaware that beneath his feet, the palace was learning weight. Each body added mass. Each sealed wall increased pressure. The tunnels were no longer just passages of removal. They were becoming a foundation built not from stone alone, but from everything the court could not afford to remember. The tunnels changed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, yet with a will that outlasted the lifespans of the servants who carried their burdens through them. Stone, once cold and indifferent, began to remember the touch of flesh, the faint residue of sweat, the oils left behind by powdered wigs that brushed against walls too narrow to permit ceremony. Blood left traces too thin to mark a floor, yet rich enough to permeate the pores of stone, leaving a copper tang that would linger for days, then weeks, then months. Bodies that waited too long to be moved, stacked temporarily behind hastily erected partitions, began to bleed into the memory of the palace itself. The rot of organs, the subtle collapse of cartilage, the drying of tissues into forms vaguely human, formed a scent that was impossible to disguise, but even courtiers above failed to notice it except as an occasional, faint sweetness that lingered under heavy perfumes and burning wax. The walls became slick to the touch, though no water ran freely through the corridors. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if the stone itself inhaled and exhaled, responding to footsteps with a subtle vibration beneath the hand. Those who worked below for years began to notice this with unease. Their palms grew sensitive, their fingers pausing mid-motion to register the shift of pressure under their skin. The tunnels no longer carried only bodies. They carried awareness. The stone watched, or remembered, or both. It marked where flesh pressed most heavily, where linen had left its scent, where sweat pooled invisibly in seams between slabs. Every night, when the corridors were quiet and the servants moved in whispered steps, the stone seemed to settle further, pressing outward against wood and brick, rearranging subtly the shape of its own chambers. Bones began to accumulate in corners, behind walls that were erected to keep the growing mass from encroaching into paths still needed. Femurs were laid with attention beside broom handles and broken mops. Skulls rolled into corners like props left from a rehearsal, their empty sockets reflecting flickering candlelight. Vertebrae leaned against walls, shoulders pressed against support beams, as if trying to understand their place in the architecture. No effort was made to catalog these remains. Names did not matter, and numbers were irrelevant. They were measured only by the space they occupied, the weight they added, the scent they exuded. The palace did not mourn them. It did not need to. Above, light and reflection and music proceeded without interruption, but below, a private history accumulated, layer by layer, silently, insistently. The smell grew stronger after royal celebrations. Feasts that lasted for hours, balls that stretched deep into the night, music that thundered through the grand gallery, all left traces in the tunnels below. Bodies were delivered more frequently afterward, either through fatigue, fainting, or something more sinister hidden in the relentless service expected of every hand in the palace. The scent was thick and heavy, almost luxurious, sweet with decay, perfumed with the residue of powdered wigs and scented oils, and impossible to ignore for anyone descending too far. Those who worked in these corridors learned to avoid looking too closely, because the piles seemed to shift when observed, or perhaps when ignored. One night a skull appeared in a different alcove than it had been the evening before. A femur rolled slightly under the pressure of stone settling, or perhaps the curiosity of something that had learned to move. Servants spoke less of it, their fear folded into habit. Footsteps slowed when passing near stacked bodies. Lanterns were carried carefully, light held at angles that reduced glare, to avoid attracting attention from whatever intelligence had begun to inhabit the tunnels. Some swore they felt heat where the walls pressed too closely, where the stone seemed not inert but conscious. Others noticed small tremors beneath their feet, irregular but persistent, as if the palace was aware of each movement above and below. They began to leave offerings, scraps of food, pieces of cloth, trinkets that had been dropped and forgotten in service. These items disappeared after a few nights, rearranged or absorbed into the tunnels, but the stone remained. The architecture itself seemed to adapt. Ceilings slanted without explanation, corners narrowed slowly, so that passage felt longer than the steps measured. Water channels redirected slightly, stones that had been loose above ground were subtly moved, and the false walls erected to contain bones bowed inward, compressing the piles into denser forms. No human hand accounted for these changes, yet each generation of servants discovered that the corridors resisted alterations, that every modification was met with a subtle pushback, an almost imperceptible tension in the air. The palace below became self-correcting, an organism composed of stone, bone, and the memories of those who had been consigned to it. By the middle of the decade, a routine had developed. Bodies were carried, wrapped, stacked, and then left. The scent accumulated, a layer of Versailles beneath Versailles, a shadow palace built from what the world refused to name. The air was thick with it, the walls glossy from repeated touches and sweat, the floor a slick testament to the years of movement and pressure. Servants carried it, breathed it, and lived within it, yet refused acknowledgement. Any attempt to speak aloud of the tunnels or the piles resulted in unease, sudden headaches, or a creeping nausea that drove the observer to leave. Silence became part of the ritual, and observation itself a dangerous indulgence. Above, the palace continued its endless performance. Mirrors multiplied light, music and laughter carried across rooms designed to astonish, and guests marveled at the luxury of Versailles without knowing the cost. Below, the tunnels taught themselves the weight of life and the smell of death, the shape of bodies pressed together, the density of a collection that grew daily. The servants who descended at night could feel it pressing, subtle and patient, into their lungs, into their hands, into the soles of their feet. It was never violent, yet impossible to ignore. Versailles was not only a palace. It was a body, and the tunnels beneath it were its digestive system, consuming and transforming, layer upon layer, learning the palace as it had learned its inhabitants. And the more the palace celebrated above, the more the tunnels below seemed to feed, to swell, to remember. By the time the court noticed, it was already too late to stop listening. The first hints came not from sight, but from sound, or the lack of expected sound, rippling through the corridors beneath the gilded halls. Night watchmen, trained to hear the faintest scuff of silk or the faint creak of a polished floorboard, reported anomalies. Footsteps echoed too late, or not at all. A soft rhythm emerged from the tunnels below, pacing, measured and patient, as if the palace itself had learned to walk. It did not hurry. It did not stumble. It waited, aware of every tread above, every foot that pressed too heavily, every whisper that dared intrude on its carefully cultivated silence. Guards dismissed their reports at first, attributing the sounds to wind in chimneys, settling of stone, rats perhaps, yet the unease persisted. Something lived beneath the mirrors, and it had learned how to make itself known without moving in a conventional sense. The floors above, designed to astonish with polished wood, marble, and patterned tiles, now betrayed an unfamiliar warmth under the careful steps of courtiers. Silk shoes pressed into surfaces that seemed to give slightly, almost soft, as if the stone and wood had grown conscious of weight and pressure. No architecture was meant to behave this way. The chandeliers above multiplied the light into infinity, reflecting endless rooms, corridors, and ceilings, yet below, the palace had become a shadow of itself. The tunnels absorbed everything, the weight of bodies, the faint exhalations of breath, the subtle vibrations of footsteps, even the small shivers that traveled through the servants who moved at night. Stone, mortar, and bone had begun to record more than shape. They recorded attention, compliance, and defiance, storing it with patient diligence. Servants disappeared more often as the years passed, vanishing into the corridors behind tapestries or through narrow staircases no guest would ever see. When a body was lost, no official mention followed. The palace compensated by hiring 2 more, sometimes 3, new hands to maintain the appearance of uninterrupted service. These replacements were rarely trained, rarely given adequate guidance, and rarely lasted longer than a week. Their absence barely registered above. Below, the tunnels accepted each new offering silently, folding it into the growing mass of memory and scent, the piles shifting slightly, as if acknowledging the arrival of fresh flesh. It was neither cruelty nor negligence. Versailles did not mourn. It metabolized, converting life into structure, into air, into pressure, into the faint, unnameable smell that rose to the surface during evening gatherings and masked itself beneath perfumes. The rhythm of the palace changed imperceptibly. Courtiers noticed it in subtle ways. A floorboard that groaned differently under the weight of a dancing duchess, a step that echoed when it should not have, a faint vibration beneath the soles of their feet that matched no drum, no music, and no pulse of the heart. The mirrors reflected perfection, but the palace beneath reflected something else entirely: accumulation, adaptation, patience. It had learned which footsteps mattered, which whispered commands were urgent, which servants were watchful, and which were negligent. Every sigh, every tremble, every errant shuffle was catalogued in the stone, adding to the consciousness of Versailles in ways that could not be documented, for words above ground could never capture what lay beneath. Lantern light descended irregularly in the service tunnels, and the few who moved at night began to feel the weight of attention in addition to the weight of bodies. Air thickened near stacked femurs and skulls pressed into alcoves. The stone beneath their hands pulsed faintly, rhythmically, in a manner that suggested deliberation. Some servants imagined whispers following them, though no mouth formed them, no wind carried them, and yet the effect was undeniable. Fear became as much a part of movement as care or discretion. They learned to keep their eyes lowered, their hands relaxed but alert, their minds focused on tasks rather than curiosity. Any attempt to linger brought headaches and a sensation of suffocation, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The palace beneath did not need violence to assert itself. It required compliance. Royal celebrations accelerated the process. Balls that stretched until the dawn, feasts that lasted hours, music that hammered the senses, and perfumed air that clung to everything above ground only enriched the palace's collection below. Each new visitor, each new coat, each drop of sweat contributed to the slow growth. The tunnels filled incrementally, walls slicked with residue, false partitions groaning under the mass of bones and accumulated weight. The stone adapted to each intrusion, bending slightly to accommodate, pressing gently against the stacks, maintaining the careful equilibrium of what could not be acknowledged. It remembered all of it: the order of arrivals, the subtle shifts of bones, the careful placement of cloth and trinkets left behind by frightened hands. By the middle of the decade, a routine had formed. The palace above continued to dazzle, oblivious to the consciousness growing beneath its floor. Courtiers assumed that the faint smells, the odd vibrations, and the sensation of soft warmth beneath foot were tricks of imagination or fatigue. The servants who traversed the tunnels knew better. They moved in synchrony with the building, stepping lightly, pausing where the stone told them, bending where the tunnels had narrowed, avoiding corners that had become too crowded with accumulated matter. Time lost meaning below, nights stretched endlessly, each repetition reinforcing the palace's memory, its rhythm, its appetite. Versailles became both stage and organism. Light multiplied endlessly above, music and laughter carried through gilded corridors, while below, the tunnels observed, learned, and accumulated. Each body, each whisper, each footstep pressed into stone added to a slow, deliberate consciousness. The palace had grown patient enough to wait for decades, absorbing, metabolizing, and cataloging without error or judgment. Above, life went on. Below, Versailles continued to feed, its appetite now subtle but insistent, a quiet pulse beneath the grandeur, preparing for a reckoning no courtier could foresee and no reflection could betray. Decades passed, and renovations swept through Versailles with a sense of triumph over decay, sealing many of the old passages with mortar and stone, as if the palace could forget what it had consumed. Officially, the dead had been removed, reburied in mass graves, their presence erased from any account that might reach the public or court records. Marble floors were polished, gilded cornices replaced, tapestries refreshed, and every mirror scrubbed to remove the faintest trace of dust or smudge that could hint at what lingered beneath. Guests marveled at the continuity of splendor, unaware that each renewal only pressed more weight upon the hidden corridors below, layers of bone and residue compacted with patience and intent. Unofficially, the lower levels grew crowded with what history refused to carry upward. Femurs pressed against walls like pillars, skulls stacked so that sockets faced every direction, vertebrae forming uneven but stable ridges across the floor. Stone adapted subtly to the accumulation, shifting in ways imperceptible to the human eye, compressing the material into a denser, almost living structure. The dead learned the palace as it had learned them, molding themselves to the arches and passageways, their presence no longer passive but patient and insistent. The pressure beneath the floors increased with the passage of years. Where once a corridor might yield slightly to the touch of a servant, it now pressed back with a quiet resistance, subtle enough to unsettle those untrained in its ways. Floors seemed heavier, ceilings slightly lower in the corners, and the air thickened in some areas, carrying faint whiffs of decay and powder, oils and incense, sweat and wax, an aroma the palace itself had cultivated and perfected. Mirrors above, polished to perfection, began to reflect more than their rooms. Some caught glimpses of subtle movement, shadows that did not correspond to human forms, reflections that lingered where no figure had passed. On certain mornings, particularly after heavy rain or the long heat of summer, fine cracks spiderwebbed across mirrored surfaces, sharp lines racing outward as if something below had shifted its weight and pressed upward with patient insistence. Courtiers whispered of unexplained drafts, chills in corners that could not be reached by open windows, and a subtle vibration beneath foot that disappeared when measured by any device, leaving only sensation. The servants who worked in the palace long enough to know the signs spoke less and moved more carefully. They adjusted their steps according to subtle cues, a shift in air pressure, the faint warmth under marble tiles, the way floorboards hummed softly in some areas while remaining inert elsewhere. Those who ignored these signs found themselves uneasy, their minds invaded by a vague but persistent dread, as if the palace was aware of attention and disapproved of curiosity. Some would awaken with unexplained bruises, fingertips tender as if pressed too firmly against something unyielding, and sometimes the faint, metallic tang of old blood in the air greeted them when they entered passages that were no longer marked on any map. The corridors were alive, though alive in a sense different from any human understanding. They adapted, learned, and remembered, compressing not only the bones beneath them but the attention and fear of all who walked above. Renovations, intended to sanitize and beautify, only strengthened the hidden structures. False walls, installed to redirect guests or cover structural imperfections, pressed against accumulations of bone, compressing them into tighter forms. Any attempt to clear the spaces for maintenance was met with subtle resistance. Beams shifted, mortar crumbled without explanation, tools became difficult to manipulate. Lanterns carried by workmen swayed of their own accord, casting shadows that moved against the direction of light. Some items, left in storage beneath the palace, disappeared overnight, as if absorbed by the hidden organism below. Even the air itself seemed to thicken in response to intrusion, breathing subtly harder to accommodate the new weight and reassert the authority of the space. Above ground, Versailles appeared eternal. Sunlight reflected perfectly off gold and crystal, orchestras played in galleries that shimmered like liquid light, and guests admired the palace as if time had paused in reverence. Yet below, centuries of accumulation, bodies, oils, sweat, dust, the echoes of service and disappearance, had transformed the corridors into a living memory. They were not sentient in the human sense, but they responded to stimulus with patience and calculation. Mirrors cracked, floors pressed, air thickened, and shadows lingered where no shape could account for them. The palace had become a vessel of continuity, a slow digestive organism, one that had been fed by generations of those whose lives were measured in steps and whispers and absences. Sometimes, maintenance crews discovered subtle anomalies. Tiles shifted ever so slightly when walked upon, staircases shortened by fractions of inches overnight, and the faint warmth of stone beneath hands lingered long after touch. Skeletons shifted, stacked so that skulls leaned slightly, femurs aligned against walls with care, vertebrae forming subtle ridges, all silent, all patient. No noise announced these movements. They happened slowly, with deliberate subtlety. Only those attuned to the palace's rhythms noticed, and some, after decades of observation, claimed that the tunnels had begun to take direction from the palace itself, molding the shape of the stones and bones to the architecture above, preparing for some future, unknowable event. The deeper one descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Air thickened with the scent of accumulated presence, warm and almost suffocating, pressing against lungs as if the tunnels themselves breathed. Lanterns dimmed without reason, reflecting shadows that moved independently, and the faint, metallic tang of long-forgotten blood lingered in corners where mortar and stone had been pressed too tightly. Floors groaned softly, not from weight or settlement, but as if communicating with themselves, whispering in vibrations too low for human ears. The palace had aged gracefully above, but beneath, the tunnels had become an entirely separate organism, patient and deliberate, storing the memories, fears, and bodies of countless servants and forgotten courtiers. On mornings after storms, when sunlight fractured through windows and gilded surfaces above shimmered in brilliance, some mirrors would crack unexpectedly. Thin spiderweb fractures radiated outward, sharp, precise, and inexplicable, as if the pressure beneath had shifted imperceptibly, testing the ceilings and floors, asserting its presence without sound. Courtiers remarked upon these fractures with mild annoyance, attributing them to faulty craftsmanship, poor glue, or the slow decay of materials over time. No one above ground suspected the true cause, a palace metabolizing centuries of service, starvation, death, and silence, still learning, still pressing, still waiting for attention, as patient as stone itself, as relentless as memory, as inevitable as gravity. The revolution came with noise, fury, and fire, and yet Versailles endured, indifferent to the shouts, the breaking of windows, the collapse of furniture and plaster. Soldiers tore through corridors and salons, ransacking the palace, setting rooms ablaze, but the halls themselves seemed untouched, glimmering under soot-darkened mirrors that multiplied firelight into infinity. The court fled, nobles spilling into the streets with gilded slippers and powdered hair, abandoning the palace to rage and chaos. Yet below, the tunnels remained full, patient and unchanged, as if the uproar above were nothing more than a passing storm to a structure older than kingdoms. Servants had vanished decades before, their absence unnoticed until the coffers and kitchens were emptied, the tapestries left to droop like mourning curtains, but the tunnels held their charges, silent, dense, immovable. Each stair, each passageway, each false wall contained layers of memory, pressure, and matter too complex and deliberate to be disturbed by human hands. The palace above could burn, crumble, or be looted, and yet below, everything persisted, growing heavier with time, a secret organism that remembered every step, every sigh, every whispered command ever carried into the subterranean corridors. Modern restorers, centuries later, would swear that some corridors sloped differently than before, that measurements disagreed with older plans, that angles refused to meet as intended, and yet no tool could trace the changes to human error. Floors that should have been flat sagged or lifted imperceptibly, thresholds stretched or shortened by fractions of inches overnight, and lantern light bent strangely along walls where stone seemed subtly malleable. The mortar between blocks, now centuries old, had shifted in ways inconsistent with settlement, forming curves and ridges that seemed deliberate, intentional, as though the building itself had been shaping its foundation from within. Tools left unattended would disappear or be found in places impossible to reach, pushed along corridors by some invisible hand, pressed against stone that had long since absorbed the texture of human touch. Every crevice and niche contained the accumulated weight of centuries, femurs stacked against walls, skulls pressed into corners, vertebrae aligned with precision, creating support structures that were part architecture, part ossuary, part organism. The palace had learned its own geometry, adjusting slowly to accommodate the mass beneath, perfecting its balance in a way no human could calculate or interfere with. Historians and architects who descended into the tunnels felt an unease that could not be measured. The air was heavy with history, yes, but also with something else, the accumulated weight of attention and presence, of life pressed into stone, absorbed into a structure that refused to yield. Lanterns swung in perfect stillness, yet shadows flickered without source, and floors beneath foot seemed to breathe softly, pulsing in response to movement above. Some claimed to hear the faintest rhythm, a soft pacing echoing through the tunnels, so slow it might have been the stone itself remembering footsteps long erased from memory. Others reported a faint metallic scent, not unpleasant, but insistently present, clinging to lungs and nostrils, the tang of iron and decay woven into the very air, as if the palace were exhaling the residue of its history with each breath. The final discovery, when it came, was never officially announced. Beneath Versailles, the bones had fused with mortar and stone, transforming from discrete remnants of the vanished into a continuous lattice, a hidden architecture that supported the palace in ways architects could not calculate. Femurs and tibias pressed against foundations like hidden pilings. Skulls formed pressure-bearing arches where beams above rested. Vertebrae stacked in subtle curves, guiding the weight of walls and floors above in patterns too complex for modern engineering to trace. The building itself had become dependent on what it had consumed, a slow metabolism of death and material, a careful digestion of absence into stability. Foundations were no longer merely stone. They were stone intertwined with the bodies of those who had vanished into the tunnels over centuries, flesh and bone absorbed into the mortar, transformed into structural integrity. Versailles was not merely resting on the earth of France. It was resting on the people it had taken, the servants, courtiers, and forgotten lives compressed, layered, and integrated into its very design. Fire, revolt, decay, and restoration meant little to the organism below. Each event above was absorbed into the memory of the palace, folded into the hidden corridors, bones adjusting imperceptibly, stone flexing with patient precision. Renovations added layers of pressure, new walls pressing against old ones, the foundations responding with silent compliance, learning the limits of each new intervention. Mirrors above reflected perfection, symmetry, light, but below, in the tunnels, the palace kept its own geometry, one built of attention, fear, patience, and bodies. Any misstep above caused subtle shifts below, a creak where none should be, a hairline crack, a vibration that traveled just beneath the soles of shoes, felt but unmeasurable. The palace had become an organism conscious in ways humans could not perceive, a slow, deliberate intelligence rooted in accumulation and endurance. Even as Versailles opened to tourists, its halls gleaming under electricity rather than candlelight, the tunnels continued their quiet work. Modern footfalls, cameras, and cleaning crews added nothing new or noteworthy. The palace had long since accounted for centuries of movement. Bones adjusted imperceptibly, stone flexed, and air thickened in patterns older than any record. Tourists admired symmetry, opulence, and mirrors, unaware of the patient intelligence below. Archaeologists and restorers occasionally felt the weight of presence, a sensation of floors pressing upward against boots, of air moving with a purpose, of shadows lingering too long. None could articulate what they sensed. Only some felt an inexplicable respect and a faint unease that followed them home. By the time any human fully comprehended the scale, it was already irrelevant. The palace's balance no longer depended on living structures above. It was sustained by what it had absorbed, fused, and integrated below. Stone, mortar, and bone had become inseparable, supporting the palace in silence, unyielding, patient, eternal. France had believed itself to have toppled kings, revolutionized society, and abandoned Versailles to history. Yet the palace remained, perfectly balanced, indifferent to crowns and citizens alike, because it was resting not on mere earth, but on the very people it had quietly consumed, and who could never, escape it. The foundation held, and would hold, until the end of human reckoning, and perhaps beyond, a dark testament to endurance, absorption, and the patient, perfect hunger of Versailles.